relationships are a core part of the way I work and what really sort of attracted me to GCP, this part of the market. But it's not always all about being best friends. It's about being steely, having that drive and making sure that you're focused on where as a group you need to get to.
The leaning towards an entrepreneurial side in the US, which maybe was not quite the same in the UK, that doesn't, in one sense it doesn't surprise me, but in another it does, that so early those seeds have already been sown.
Everyone is focused on the first job. Everyone is sort of asking the question, how do I get into banking? How do I get into trading? Whereas when I think about my experience in the US, it was, how do I set up my own business?
I think you guys are now on deal 49. Is that right? So is there a little internal sweepstake as to who can get deal 50?
We talk about it all the time with the businesses that we back. What is it that makes you special? What is your right to win? I think that is as relevant to a private equity house as it is to the underlying businesses that you look to invest in.
So Ravi, welcome to Life of A Dealmaker. You are the first guest we've had on who I've not had a working experience with before. And so we've created a feature which we've inelegantly called the icebreaker. We did actually try quite hard to try and work out a private equity themed or transaction based analogy which we could use, much like the rollover. And the only thing we could come up with was the KYC check, which didn't really work. So as you can see on Life of Dealmaker, we've got a film crew of 3 people, and we've asked each of them to write a question which is less about your career and private equity and more about getting to know you as a person. So I'm going to start with those. So question number 1 is, at this moment in time, what is top of your bucket list?
Growing up, I played a lot of golf. Loved golf. Probably my favourite sport growing up, but it's one of those where as you sort of move to London, start a family, start working pretty hard, it's not really a sport that sort of lends itself to, it's a big time commitment to sort of keep going with it. So I've sort of turned definitely into a corporate social golfer. But this year I've probably played 5 or 6 times already. I've got another 5 or 6 rounds lined up and definitely getting the bug back a little bit. So, on the back of the British Open that was last weekend, I've been to Augusta National to watch the Masters, but I think playing that course would absolutely be top of the bucket list for me.
So I think I have to ask you what your handicap is.
Is or was, because I was still dining out on my former
Let's
glories.
go was first.
It was 8. I still try to blag 16-ish, but very, very, very rarely play to that.
Okay. Number 2 is, if you had the chance to pick 3, you don't need to do 3, but if you want to, you can, 3 famous dead or alive dinner guests for a dinner party, who would it be and why? I think the idea behind the 3 is that we want to get an idea from you about who you think would have chemistry with one another.
Can I come back to that one?
You can come back to that one, so that's a pass. You get 1 pass. And let's reduce it to 1 as well, so you can... 1 dinner party guest. And then the final one is there a personal book that has inspired you and helped you achieve your goals in life?
My favourite book is, different question, The Count of Monte Cristo. And I think part of the reason I like that book so much is because the main character is so different to me. So he's got a bit of he's been, I don't know if you've read the book, but he's been very wronged in his life. He ended up getting framed, thrown in prison for a number of years for something that he didn't do. And whilst he was there, just developed this very, very revengeful streak. So he came out, and his entire raison d'etre from when he came out of prison was getting back on all the people that wronged him.
Yeah.
Which is completely the opposite to me. But I think sort of that edge around sort of really trying to sort of drive yourself and make sure that you aren't taken advantage of, I think is a really key skill that is actually applicable across a load of different disciplines.
So finding an edge almost, which are you suggesting maybe not necessarily one you had naturally or innately?
Absolutely. And the need to develop that and be steely when you have to be. I think we'll probably come on to talking a lot about relationships. Relationships are a core part of the way I work and what really sort of attracted me to GCP, this part of the market. but it's not always all about being best friends. It's about being steely, having that drive and making sure that you're focused on where as a group you need to get to.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, I think we're sufficiently acquainted, so maybe we'll come back to the dinner party question as well in time. But
I must say as well, we have never worked together. We've only met each other a couple of times, but I have watched all of your podcasts, and I think you do a brilliant job. And actually, watching them all, I feel like I knew you already, so I don't need to break the ice the other way around.
So it's only one way, the one-way icebreaker. So segueing, I guess, now into your career, I always like to try and start by having some kind of flavour as to how, in the pre-career phase, so pre-employment period, what there was in there which was a formative, or the most formative experience that you had, whether that was school or after university. Where would you pinpoint as being that?
I think for me it was definitely university, and I guess if you wind the clock back a little bit before that, it was the drivers for me to go down the route of business. So I studied management at Warwick University. I was fortunate enough to get sort of a scholarship exchange to Wharton Business School in the States, and I think for me that all came from a little bit of my sort of upbringing. So dad's a Indian doctor, came over here, worked incredibly hard, and that sort of mindset around working and studying is something that was really sort of drilled into me from an early age. So for me, it was all about sort of getting the best education, getting a good degree, and opening up doors for you that way. And what I sort of really enjoyed during my school years was business and finance, and did a couple of classes in that when I was at school, which sort of led me on the path to Warwick. And a key reason for me deciding to go to Warwick actually was the opportunity to go to the States, and particularly Wharton Business School. And both of those experiences were really sort of formative and fantastic in different ways. I think they're both very, very good business schools. If I was to think about the difference between the two, Wharton in the US was incredibly entrepreneurial. So when I was at Warwick, it was great, really driven classmates, good setup, good teaching, good resources. Everyone was focused on the first job. Everyone was sort of asking the question, how do I get into banking? How do I get into trading? Whereas when I think about my experience in the US, it was, how do I set up my own business? How do I join private equity? It was just a slightly different mindset that sort of really brought out that entrepreneurial flair in me, if you can call it flair. If I then go back to sort of my start, my roots and all the rest of it, I think the private equity route was always sort of the route I could see myself taking, rather than setting up your own business, because you get to be a bit of an entrepreneur in your own business. You get to work with entrepreneurs, you get to support them in scaling and helping them to scale what they've sort of built, without taking on all the risk of starting it up and doing it yourself.
Yeah, security blanket of the brand. And
yeah, absolutely.
But so I guess a couple of things I'm interested in there. So one of them is when you talk about that early stage direction towards business and finance, what would you say came first? Was it interest or desire? I'm really asking to the backdrop of what you're saying about your father worked hard, put you on this, you felt like you're on a track. Did you feel like you learned the interest having had the desire to get into that, or did you feel like the interest was natural and so then all you needed to do was put the ethic in?
Yeah, I think the interest came first. So understanding businesses, understanding how they work, understanding how people can build them up to a certain stage, but how do they get to the next level? I think I was always sort of fascinated in that. And, when you do business studies at school, it's sort of all quite theoretical and formulaic, but actually taking the time to go and spend time with family friends, people who had built up their own businesses was really sort of quite eye-opening for me.
And then the other point, which I think, is something I was going to ask you about, because of the fact that very early in your development, you had this exposure to another business culture, as it were. Do you feel like there's a difference generally in business culture, or is it something to do with how you develop as a youth?
I think it's something cultural. I think it's something about the way the kids that I sort of studied with over there sort of were brought up and driven. And one of the things that massively struck me was, at Warwick, people were very driven. It was a next level over there, and it's an Ivy League school. I think the fees at that point were $50,000 a year. I was lucky because it was an exchange program. I think mine was £500, and that was less than the cost of the gym membership there. But I do remember the first week when I was there, it was the first Friday walking past the library and it was full of people studying, and that would have never been anything that would have occurred to me in my sort of first year back after a long summer holiday. So I think number one, the drive was really there, but it was an entrepreneurial drive. I did have classmates who actually dropped out of Wharton because they had a business idea and they wanted to go and follow that dream and set it up. And one of them did set it up. He built the business over 5 or 6 years and sold it for an awful lot of money sort of only a few years later. And it's that sort of risk-taking approach that I sort of hadn't seen in my university career over here.
And it feels like maybe that culture was almost encouraged or glamorized even at that stage.
Absolutely.
So then you start your first job is at Ernst & Young. So probably the answer to the question is relatively simple because it's obviously a well-trodden path and a huge name. But what led you to decide that would be the first step for your career?
One, it was back to the idea of not closing off any doors. So I think getting that sort of accountancy qualification I knew would be a good sort of platform, a good bedrock from which I could build things from. But that time in the States really did make me think early on around the route into private equity. So actually, EY, when I sort of was going through that process, had just started a rotation program focused purely on private equity and private equity clients. So we spent sort of 6 to 8 months in each of M&A, financial due diligence, commercial due diligence, restructuring, which sort of for me, getting onto that program, getting sort of access to the different elements of a transaction, and more importantly, getting access to the people. So private equity clients, I think, was something I was hugely keen to do. And EY was a great experience for me. I think, you come in after university, you're in a cohort of 40 or 50 other people, like-minded, driven, looking to build their career. It is a great place to sort of learn the theory. I think the two sort of slight challenges I had with my time at EY, one was timing. So it was all around the global financial crisis, which then sort of led to a slight shortage of deals. But then the other piece really, for me, that rotation program on paper is brilliant. But actually 6 months in any discipline isn't a great amount of time. So I got to the end of my sort of qualification sort of period and had spent time in each of these different disciplines, but actually had never worked on a deal from start to finish when you overlay the GFC at the same time as that as well. So I got to my qualification, I'd built a brilliant network, I'd sort of learnt all the theory, but I'd never done a deal.
So that was 06 to 09, that?
Correct.
So right in the middle of financial crisis.
And actually, I talk about the rotation program. I joined the M&A business the day Lehman went bust. So I spent a lot of time the next 6 months profiling businesses and writing speculative pitches, but actually not getting stuck into any live deal process.
Yeah, and did you feel like you knew? Because I was also a junior in that phase, and looking back now, I think maybe I probably didn't appreciate how seismic the issues were that were going on. I probably straight out of university probably thought this cyclical element is typical within the industry. But do you feel like you appreciated or was the sentiment within EY at the time such that you could understand, again, that something quite serious is going on here?
Yeah, I could definitely get that it was something serious, but you're right. I was right at the bottom of the ladder. I was sort of working where I was told to work. There was stuff to sort of keep you busy and keep you out of trouble, but you didn't get a sense of actually what it meant in the private equity industry and what it would have done for people's deal flow because of lack of liquidity and concerns around the economy and all the rest of it. I didn't get to see any of that firsthand. So whilst I was aware of something, to really sort of appreciate the impact it had, that probably came a few years later. And actually probably when I joined Clearwater, which was my next move, and seeing how they were sort of rebuilding their business post financial crisis.
Yeah, and so it seems like you were quite clear on private equity early. So then when the opportunity arose to come into corporate finance, which is obviously the usual route in, you took it. Is that fair? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I did have a couple of sort of colleagues at that point who went straight into private equity, and I did think about it, but back to the point around the deal experience and really sort of knowing what to expect, knowing your way around a deal, I think that was the bit that was lacking. And I think really getting that experience over the next 3, 4, 5 years was massively important to me.
So 4 years at Clearwater, how was your experience there, and how do you feel it prepped you for when you eventually arrived at GCP.
Yeah, it was a brilliant 4 years, and actually that transition from EY into Clearwater was probably bigger than my transition from Clearwater into GCP and this side of the table. I think one much smaller organisation. So again, back to the timing of it, the business had to retrench a bit during the financial crisis. It was end of 2009, start of 10, starting to sort of build their business again. And the London team was very, very small. I think there were 4 partners and me when I joined, and we sort of slowly rebuilt it from there. But being in this massive organisation where you're sort of one of many, and the deal flow was slightly limited at that time, to being in a smaller entrepreneurial business where deal flow was the absolute sort of bread and butter that helps the business survive, and needing to roll your sleeves up and get stuck in was hugely important. So doing that from a position of not having that much experience was quite an eye-opener for me. And I do remember in that first year, for the best part of 12 months, just feeling immensely stressed. And I've thought back about it quite a lot. I think it's because I didn't know what to expect. So I did 2 deals in that first year. There were 2 deals that were at completely opposite ends of the spectrum. So one was a tech services, private equity-backed business that had come into sort of trouble. The bank was holding the keys, essentially, and Clearwater had been appointed to get the best possible solution for shareholders, stakeholders, etc. But it was a very, very challenging deal process that every which way, it was like whack-a-mole. Every which way you turned, there was another issue. Who owned the shares hadn't properly been sort of established, and with some of the people, there were trading issues, there were customer issues. So just navigating that process was a challenge. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we were working with a fast growth employee benefits business, sort of built around a SaaS platform. So it was a business called Asperity at the time, became Reward Gateway, Inflection, ended up doing that deal. But it was a 3-year-old business, a brilliant entrepreneurial sort of founder who was really driven on growth. And that process was all around building competitive tension, managing the sort of right flow of information at the right time to the investors, to really sort of drive a good, aggressive process that would go to ultimately sort of value and the best deal for the client. And just sort of working with those 2 different situations at the same time was slightly mind-blowing. But when you overlay, for me, every single step of both of those processes was brand new. And I think that's the piece that was sort of adding to the stress from my perspective, because it was the anticipation and knowing what comes next. But again, I do remember both deals completed within about a week of each other at the end of 2010, and the impact it had for me the following year, sort of knowing a lot more, your way around a deal, knowing that there are difficult situations that come up, even in the positive sort of deal processes, and that you can navigate them and more importantly, drive the deals, I think was massively important for me as in sort of my development as a deal doer.
I mean, that's a phenomenal acceleration, isn't it? From having come from an environment where you felt maybe you didn't have the right level of exposure in terms of start to finish on deals, and then suddenly to all in, same time, completely different.
Absolutely. Me plus a partner. So there wasn't tiers and tiers and tiers of people in between. I had to do everything. I had to understand everything. And it was that was, making me really try and get up the curve around knowing what comes next and how to anticipate.
And so the point at which you decide to make the move into private equity, what were you looking for in terms of type of brand and type of firm?
There were a couple of pieces that were really important to me. One was the right part of the market. So that sort of lower mid-market, entrepreneurial-led, owner-managed, relationships really important, I think was key for me. It was, I love building relationships with the CEOs, CFOs that I'd worked with at sort of Clearwater, and then being able to work with those same sorts of individuals was very important to me as I looked to sort of build my private equity career. I think the other piece linked in with that was the growth agenda. So I didn't want to go into sort of operational turnaround type funds. For me, I like the positive growth stories, and how can you get something that has got a great management team, a really good market position, and an exciting growth story, and work with those founders to sort of help them scale it. I think that was what sort of really attracted me to this part of the market and GCP in particular. I think the other piece about GCP was it was a very, very exciting time to join the business. So GCP had sort of recently done its own buyout from Close Brothers, where they'd been previously. So it was, partway through investing Fund 3, but essentially Fund 1 as an independent, and really had exciting, ambitious plans to continue building that as an independent private equity investor.
Yeah, so you joined in 2014.
Yep.
And I think I watched the graphic on the website, which is actually quite a good way of showing in a very quick format. But so 1999 was when the senior leadership group came together and started investing. I know that's before the GCP brand arose, but it looked like you've effectively been going in some form for 25 years.
Absolutely, yeah. And originally it was part of Close Brothers, and then since 2009 it has been as an independent. And
now investing out of Fund 5.
Correct.
So there's some areas of the website I'm sure you'll want to take me in certain directions in terms of explaining the GCP investment thesis and where you are now. But some of the things which struck me. So obviously very partnership focused. I think you describe yourselves as the original partnership focused firm, and then the capital being flexible and patient. So just I guess interested in your perspective as to what that terminology means to you and how that informs your investment work.
Yeah, and I think those 2 points go hand in hand really around the partnership side of things. And actually, in one of your previous podcasts, I think it was Zaina Baines, she talked about the start of her career. There pretty much being one flavour of private equity, sort of LBOs, institutional type buyouts, and it was exactly that dynamic which led GCP, or as was back then, to be sort of founded in 1999. I think there was many different leverage buyouts and institutional buyout type investors, but this idea of a partnership investor to come in, invest alongside entrepreneurs, invest alongside owner managers, the structure is just about making the deal work, but essentially it's being as comfortable as a minority or majority investor, but really investing alongside them to support them scaling and providing the right sort of funding to enable them to do that. So that's been our ethos right from the outset. So what does that mean in practice? I think for me, partnership comes across, the way I think about partnership, there's two core areas of it. One is our style. So for us, that's really about being honest, straightforward, open to deal with, because it is back to the relationship. It's about driving growth together, and helping to influence and drive change through the relationship rather than sort of relying on legal docs or anything like that. It's being very open, transparent with each other to say, this is what we're looking to build together. What's the route through to do that? How are you going to contribute? How am I going to contribute? And how do we do that in a joined up way where we're open and honest with each other? I think is massively important. And then the other piece for me then is around, and I think this has become increasingly important, it's sort of the credibility. How are you going to support value? How are you going to support driving growth? Which I think from my perspective comes with some of the specialism around the sectors that you invest in and the situations that you've been involved in to help businesses scale.
Yeah. And so that flexibility, so obviously you do that, it's part of your strategy that you do both majority and minority. And when you approach or begin discussions with management teams, how does that manifest itself in terms of what comes first? At what point during a conversation does it start to crystallize in from GCP's perspective as to this is the percentage we want and this is the majority/minority position we want, or is that management led?
Yeah, for me, that's maths. That's how do you make the deal structure work and to drive the right returns. I think from our perspective, a lot of it depends on the specific situation. So if you've got one or two founders who are looking to take a bit of cash off the table, maybe a bit of development capital into the business, that lends itself a lot more to a minority situation where they can retain most of the business. You can put an attractive sweet equity pot in place for incentivizing the rest of the team. If it tends to be maybe one institutional owner, so a secondary buyout, they've got 60 or 70% of the equity already, they're looking to exit in full, to make the deal work, the next investor probably needs to be a majority investor as well. I think the important piece from our perspective is whether we're minority or majority, our style, our approach, the way that we interact with the management team doesn't really change. We're there still being a supportive investor, supporting them to scale, and really helping to influence through that presence at the board.
And so from an investor skill set perspective, what do you think are the key skills that are when selling to and partnering specifically with founders, what do you think are the key skills that are required of an investor in a way which maybe is different to as you start to scale up through the market segments?
I think it's that sort of relationship piece and sort of the understanding, the empathy is massively important when you're working with founders, entrepreneurs. To an extent, well, it is their baby, that they poured their life soul into building this business up. Just the decision for them to take into external investment, dilute themselves down through the structure, get someone sat alongside them, where they're not sort of the sole decision maker anymore, is a massive decision for them to go through. So for them to pick the right partner, the one that's going to work with them in the right way, support them, but also add value on the journey, being able to demonstrate that to them, I think, is massively important. The key bit for me that I think getting right through any deal is what makes it, or what helps it become a success or otherwise, is getting the alignment piece right with management up front. So when you're working with that sort of entrepreneur or set of entrepreneurs, what are we trying to build and achieve together, and how are we going to get there? Recognizing that we're all humans and everyone's working as hard as they can. That's what helps you to sort of make the tough decisions along the journey to get you to that end goal.
So I think you guys are now on deal 49. Is that right?
Correct.
Nice. So is there a little internal sweepstake as to who can get deal 50? Who can get deal 50 done first?
There isn't, but I like that. I might take that back.
Okay, so I think moving on to career highlights and lowlights. Well, I don't know where you want to start first, whether there's a particular moment in time across your career which you felt was a pinnacle, particularly exciting, particularly momentous, and then equally I want to cover the opposite, which is an area where you felt really troubled or challenged or that was particularly difficult.
So on the highlights, couple of things sort of spring to mind for me. I've recently made partner at GCP, so that happened at the turn of this year, and I think whilst clearly that's one moment in time, it's sort of a culmination of everything you've done in your career up to that point. You've got a sort of a body of work built on the deals that you've done, the people that you've worked with, the impact you've made across your business, sort of the broader industry. So I think having that moment from my perspective was a real highlight, and almost the hard work starts here in a way, because now it's about continuing to drive GCP, drive the brand, think about sort of where we go next from here, and being a sort of a core part of that machine, I think is really important to me. And
on that, I mean, that's there's, I think over the last few years in particular, there started to become a trend in the legal industry where it's not as typical anymore as it was 10 years ago, and definitely not as it was 20 years ago, where somebody joins a firm and then stays there and becomes a partner. Now I think most people being promoted to partnership have been at one, at least, potentially two firms before. Was it for you, was there ever a question mark over that as to whether the right way to get to partnership was to look elsewhere or to find ways to leverage an interim position? Or were you always steadfast, I feel I'm in the right place and I've got conviction that because there's a marriage here, it's going to happen? Yeah,
I think definitely the latter. So for me, I knew GCP was the right home when I sort of walked in the door. And I remember actually going through the interview process and speaking to James and Garrett, our sort of managing partners, around what I wanted as my next step. And I very clearly said, for me, this isn't a stepping stone into the industry. I want somewhere where I can build a career, where I can be part of something. And it goes back to what I said earlier around where GCP was in its evolution at that time, having sort of done its own buyout and really thinking about how they were sort of scaling the business. I think that felt like the right home. Now, obviously, things don't always survive contact with reality. So you can have that as your mindset when you sort of move into somewhere, and you might turn up and hate it, or they might hate you. But thankfully that sort of didn't pan out like that. And I did feel from day one, when I sort of dropped into the business and started working on the types of deals, the types of situations, the people that we worked with, it felt like a really good home.
And then I guess flipping to low light, I know you tried to avoid the question, but what would you think of as a phase in your career which was, or it doesn't have to be a specific moment, but what do you find really difficult or tough?
Yeah, it is. it is a tough job, and it is one that brings highlights and lowlights, and slightly harder situations. I think businesses that I've worked with, I've had instances of fraud, I've had instances where you've lost a key client and what the impact of that. All of those are challenging moments that you do need to work through, and if you've got that trust and chemistry right with the management team, you work through it in the right sort of way. I think the piece that is always challenging is where a business for whatever reason goes through a situation where it needs a bit of a restructure. It might be market driven, it might be losing a key client, but ultimately you're in a position where the cost base doesn't quite match where the business is at that moment in time, and you either sort of hold your nerve or you think you need to make decisions around that, and going through sort of redundancy programs. Whilst thankfully it's not something that we've done loads and loads of times, every time you do it, it is difficult because it's not just numbers on a spreadsheet, it is people. And the way that we work with the businesses we invest in, we know a lot of people in those businesses. You meet them at the Christmas parties, you meet them at different company events, and actually going through those situations isn't always the easy, it's always a difficult thing to do. But then you have to remember that it's right for the long-term sustainability for the business. It's right for all the other people that are working in that business at the time. So it is ultimately the right thing to do, but it's it never gets any easier.
And they are, I think, majority of your businesses, they're people businesses, aren't they? So I guess
absolutely
that enhances the issue.
Yeah. People businesses, the knowledge economy is another thing that we talk about an awful lot, and the idea of people businesses is something that we were comfortable with a lot, far before a lot of the rest of the sort of private equity world was comfortable with. We get the fact that if you've built something that's got strategic value, that's doing something right for its clients, and then you've got a really good people base around that and a good talent engine that gets the right people in, takes them on the career journeys, incentivizes them, there's a load of value in that. But to your point, it does mean that a lot of the businesses that we back have that strong people element.
Yeah. And then ancillary to low light, this is a good time to bring in the rollover question, which we had some guest feedback about how aesthetically unpleasing our envelope had become. So we've got a brand new envelope. Brand new. All the questions have been carried across. But this one's from Gareth Wiley, who's on episode 4. What is the biggest bullet that you have dodged in your private equity career, and what did it teach you?
Bullet dodged is possibly a little bit too strong, but there was one deal in my first year at GCP that has always stuck with me. So it was an investment in a software business that was essentially sold into the oil and gas industry, sort of linked to big CapEx projects. Great management team, really good product. So all the customer referencing was hugely positive in terms of how much value that software product had sort of added to them as businesses. And we got pretty close to completing it. We got to Christmas, and there were a couple of diligence points that we hadn't quite sort of got comfortable with. So we all agreed, us and sort of the management team, that we'd put pens down over Christmas, come back in the new year to sort of try and get things done. And in that intervening period, they ended up doing a deal with a big trade player. And, at the time you think, should we have pushed it through? Should we have done more, etc.? And then if you cast your mind back to 2014, the oil price crashed and stayed crashed for a very long time. So large CapEx projects pretty much dried up for the next couple of years. So I think as a strategic trade purchase, it probably worked out okay. As a standalone private equity investment where you've got perpetual licenses sold into a market that pretty much dried up, I imagine that would have been a pretty tough first couple of years of that as an investment.
Yeah, well, so you must have thought the gods were on your side, I think.
I think it worked out for the best.
And then current market outlook, obviously we see, if you read the financial press, it feels like we're in a low moment currently in terms of M&A activity. The FT ran an article last week which talked about private equity being a hazardous terrain for investors at the moment, with a cute little picture of 4 men in suits trying to scale a mountain. But the conversations I have with people at PE firms, particularly in the middle market, is quite positive, particularly for Q4 and with hopefully interest rates coming down. How does GCP see the market landscape, and what makes you feel positive?
Yeah, very similar theme. So we've actually had a really good first half of this year. So we've done 2 new investments. We've done 2 bolt-ons into the portfolio. We've had 1 really strong exit. And sort of, we got through all of that during H1. I think definitely in the period since the election being called and now, it does feel like things have sort of slowed down a little bit from a sort of a new deal perspective. But we have focused a lot, and I think I mentioned this earlier, on sort of knowledge economy, what that means in terms of specialist services, specialist technology businesses. And we spent a lot longer in those sectors thinking about the different subsectors where we want to be spending our time getting to know businesses. So we've been tracking a number of different opportunities and getting to know management teams for the last 12, 18 months. And we're absolutely seeing some of those situations start to come to fruition now. So when you say, how do you think about H2? I think our pipeline looks pretty good, actually, but it looks pretty good on deal situations where we already know the management teams, we know the subsectors, we can really sort of spend time thinking about the investment thesis and look to hit the ground running, rather than getting to the 1st of September and a load of books land on the desk cold and you have to get up the curve pretty quickly. So, from my perspective, it's about doing all the right things to get into position on those deal opportunities so that in H2, hopefully, we do see things picking up.
And looking out further into the future, and perhaps unfairly, I'm asking you this, I've not asked it before on one of my podcasts because you're on the younger end of the partnership spectrum, but when you look at how deal doing might change in the future, and it's actually quite a hot topic at the moment, how do you see deal doing being different in, say, how punchy am I going to go, 2035?
I think we've definitely seen a shift towards specialism. So again, from our perspective, thinking about businesses that do sort of fit in our model of sort of knowledge economy, whether that's software businesses, whether it's specialist tech services that are sort of looking to get involved in different subsector themes such as cybersecurity or cloud or data and AI. I think, or more sort of specialist consulting businesses. I think the specialism piece is really important, and it does link back to the partnership bit as well, and the second bit of what I talked in the partnership. So the first bit was about style and approach and how you work together. Yeah. The second piece was how you can really support scaling and adding value and sort of drive, working with those teams to drive the next stage. And I think the more demonstrable track record you've got of working with, no 2 businesses are the same, but to your point earlier on people businesses, there are similar themes that come out of growing and scaling those businesses. There are similar pain points that those businesses go through, and being able to demonstrate, well, we've actually worked with similar businesses either in these verticals or that have got similar business models or they're solving similar client pain points. I think the more you can sort of demonstrate how you've supported those businesses and worked through, I think that management teams are increasingly looking for more than just cash. They are looking for a supportive partner to help them go on that journey. So I think that will really drive. We talk about it all the time with the businesses that we back. What is it that makes you special? What is your right to win? I think that is as relevant to a private equity house as it is to the underlying businesses that you look to invest in.
Yeah, interesting. So one more question before we go into your rollover question. You do a mentoring role for people from first generation families who are entering university for the first time. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Yeah, so it's with an organisation called Into University. So, we've spent a lot of time thinking about diversity in our own business, diversity across the industry. Every time you go through sort of a recruitment process, you want to get the right person for the job, and you want your team to be balanced and diverse, whether that's from sort of background, whether that's gender, whether that's sort of ethnicity. You want a good sort of balanced team. I guess the problem is we're all sort of, the pool is the pool. So for me, it's how do you make the pool as diverse as possible, because then you can well and truly look for the best candidates in the most diverse pool. And I think the piece for me then is, what can we do about making that pool more diverse? So for the last few years, a number of us at GCP have been working with an organisation called Into University, whose whole focus is around supporting underprivileged children from disadvantaged backgrounds, more often than not children who are the first generation in their family to go to university, to really sort of help them go through the latter years of school and make the transition into university as well. So, it's an organisation we support as a business, and a number of our, the individuals in our team do as well. We have actually just last week finished. So Into University has got sort of an offshoot organisation called Big City Bright Futures, which is essentially an intern program for people that are coming through their sort of main program. We had a couple of interns this summer working with us, and that was a brilliant experience, sort of getting to work with them and introduce them to the professional world and private equity and the different elements of our business as well.
And so what format does the mentoring take? Is it one-on-one, or is it presentation based?
It's one-on-one sort of mentoring and coaching. So they get support in a variety of different ways. From they've got different sort of sites across the UK where people come in. It's a safe place to study. They get access to different mentors that sort of understand the different sort of facets of education. And then a core part of the program is working with people like ourselves to help them navigate the transition from sixth form into university. So part of it is, how do you I don't have a big brother who's been to university before, so I don't know what the application form looks like or what's the best way to present yourself. So it's helping them and coaching them through presenting themselves and all of that, and building out some of the softer skills to get them ready for university life.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic, and it's great that you've had a recent success with it as well. Right, it's rollover question time, and at the same time, you still owe me a dinner guest.
Even thought about that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've spent the longest time actually thinking about what I'm going to write down for this.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Ravi. That goes into the new and improved rollover envelope. Dinner guest.
I'm really struggling with this one.
You don't want to invite anyone to dinner.
I like eating at home.
Ravi, it's great to meet you. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Tarun.